that this is too revolutionary and too destabilizing philosophy, and you guys all kind of reacted to it that way, you know, just from putting all the power into the legislature, but also, you know, because there's no checks and balances per se, then it seems like the only thing that you can do is fall back on the people's right to revolution. And so he does try to reassure in more than one spot that the revolution is not something that people will take on lightly and will only happen under, you know, dire circumstances. And he also discusses ways in which you can avoid getting yourself into those dire circumstances. So I think we've already looked at this passage on the top of paragraph 168, and actually on the bottom too. Let's see. Yeah, well, I'll just remind you of that, because it is one of those spots where he's trying to say, now, you know, this isn't going to happen every day. He says, nor let anyone think this lays a perpetual foundation for disorder, for this operates not till the inconveniency is so great that the majority feel it. So it's not going to happen if a minority, you know, is impacted.
Was it 168 in Leviathan, or?
No, in Locke, paragraph 168.
Oh, okay, paragraph 168.
Sorry,
okay.
Page 332.
Gotcha.
So if the majority feel it and are weary of it and find a necessity to have it amended, but this the executive power or wise princes never need come in the danger of, and it is the thing of all others that they have most need to avoid, as all of the others most perilous. So there's a little bit of warning to the executive too, to never let themselves get into a situation where the majority is so angry that they're willing to take up arms. It does leave in question, what about minority rights? He does want everybody to have these rights that he's discussed, you know, the right to self-preservation and property, and the right to a movement, freedom of speech, and those kinds of things. But with legislative supremacy, the power of the majority does seem to be, it could be problematic, let's just put it, for minorities, without any real appeal to a separate judicial system, for instance, that would have the power to overrule the majority. And we know now that sometimes minorities can cause a great deal of political upheaval, because they can use strategies that are not just open warfare, right? But guerrilla warfare, terrorism, you know, civil unrest, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, there's some weaknesses there that we can see now, that he doesn't deal with quite as well as we would want him to. But he's definitely saying, you know, a wise king, a wise executive, it does not allow things get to this level. And this is a check upon his behavior to realize.
It kind of says that this level isn't possible because a king shouldn't let it get to this level.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. It's possible, but a king should not ever let it get to this level. So that's a check, just warning the executive and, you know, even the legislature, that the people do have this power, and now they will exercise it. And history shows that they already have, and not long after this was written, they did again. So it's a real and credible threat. Okay. Well, what Locke prefers is for the people to be vigilant, okay, and especially those in Parliament to keep very close track of the executive and to take action ahead of time to make sure that the executive power doesn't get out of hand. It's a little bit trickier with the legislature's own power, but you could also apply that rationale to them as well, to keep an eye upon members of the legislative branch and to take action if you see its powers being usurped or it basically going too far with its powers.
But isn't Parliament is the legislature?
Right.
And, okay, so they're keeping that
on themselves.
Okay.
Yeah, which isn't exactly good enough, right? Yeah. But that's about what it amounts to, is keeping an eye on themselves. various members of the parliament. Okay, so this is the way he tries to deal with this. Now, as we move forward, he comes back to a pretty highly revolutionary stance, really, and you feel like he goes back and forth between, well, this can happen and you should have the right to revolt against it, but it won't happen, you know, or it won't happen very easily. So this is a little bit frustrating thing about Locke. He asked the question, for instance, what about conquest? If a power has conquered another country, does this end the state of war, or do the people have a right to revolt at some point against the conquering power? We get into a little bit of just war theory here in a way, which is kind of neat. Now, contrasting with Hobbes, remember Hobbes said that if you submit to a conqueror out of total fear for survival, that's still consent. When you have willingly consented to the social contract and you don't have a right to complain. Locke disagrees with that. So this is an area where Locke is a lot more revolutionary. If you take a look at page 334, the bottom of paragraph 172, which is up actually at the top left, about an inch down, he says, thus captives taken in a just and lawful war, and such only, are subject to a despotical power, which as it arises not from compact, so neither is it capable of any, but is the state of war continued. Okay? So captives, when he says are subject to a despotical power, he means that they basically, those captives stay in check simply because they are forced to, right? But they have no compact, he says. So and I think he's consciously disagreeing with Hobbes here. He understands Hobbes' argument, and he disagrees with it. So,
Is he, by kind of saying that if you've been captured in war, you may have to forfeit your life, is he comparing that to slavery a little bit?
Yeah. If you're forced to, then you're forced to. And you may not be able to either keep your life or control the circumstances under which you live. But that doesn't mean that you've agreed to it.
Mm-hmm.
So slavery, in a similar way, slavery is that unjust usurpation of another person's rights. And there's no agreement, because he says no one can make an agreement to be a slave. You are then giving away all of your ability to preserve yourself. So that just is illogical in his view. So absolutely. So he says captives are in a state of war. And he says, for what compact can be made with a man that is not master of his own life? What condition can he perform? And if he once allowed to be master of his own life, the despotical arbitrary power of his master ceases. So the only way that conquest can lead to a legitimate social contract is if people are removed from that despotical power. They're not simply being forced to obey, and they're given the freedom to consent. Okay. That's a very different, and again, perhaps destabilizing teaching. Hobbes is trying to, his whole focus is on stability, right? And not giving anybody any reason to revolt. And here is Locke saying, no, you have not given up any right. You're just simply forced for the time. Okay. Now, and he even goes to generations on this reasoning, saying that even if the father, the men, in other words, are forced to either die or be conquered in this way, this doesn't apply to their children or their children's children, or to their property, actually. Remember where he said previously a monarch can tell a man who was a soldier of his, to stand in the breach and basically, die if necessary, but he can't take a farthing of his, money? Well, it's a similar logic here. Conquering, even if it's in a just war, even if you're conquering justly to take back land, for instance, or to punish an aggressor, nevertheless, you can capture the combatants, but you don't have any right over their families and their families' property.
Now, did he address the question of when that generation gets older and wants to probably get revenge and go back to war?
Yeah, he did.
He did answer that?
Yes, he did, and it's in the positive. In other words, yes, generations later, people can still claim this right and try to take it back. Okay. Let's see. I've got that in my notes somewhere where he says this. Yes, on page 335, top left. And this is really, I mean, if you want to know where Locke's philosophy sounds the most destabilizing, it's here. He says, but perhaps justice is denied, or I am crippled and cannot stir, robbed, and have not the means to do it. If God has taken away all means of seeking remedy, there is nothing left but patience. But my son, when able, may seek the relief of the law when I am denied. He or his son may renew his appeal till he recover his right. But the conquered or the children have no court, no arbitrator on earth to appeal to. Then they may appeal as Jephthah did to heaven and repeat their appeal till they have recovered the native right of their ancestors, which was to have a legislative over them as the majority should approve and acquiesce in. So even generations later. So, you know, the Norman Conquest, for instance, 1066, you know, just the English people could you know, decide that the government 200 years later was illegitimate and, you know, make that claim. So there's reasons why this philosophy is seen as too revolutionary, you know. What do you think?
Well, I kind of see that, because I mean, if you have a large enough British group here in the United States, suddenly they could say, yeah, we kind of want our deal back with the crown.
Yeah, all the Anglo people here could say, well, you know, this was an illegitimate change of government. I'm an Englishman, you know. So there's practical limits based upon can you possibly do it. But the logic, the rationale is right here. I mean, if you could do it, you know, the problem with the American situation is we can't do it, right? There's not enough consensus. There might be enough Anglo-Americans to get the job done, but there's not going to be nearly the desire to do it. So, and he acknowledges that, but
I didn't really see when, maybe I missed it, you talking about when it becomes legitimate. I mean, because by now, arguably, we're a legitimate established nation.
Right.
And any attempts to undermine that.
Well, that's where that concept of tacit consent comes in. If you're living peaceably and you're not wanting to move and you're voting and participating, you have basically accepted the system. If you withdraw, if you move out to a compound, if you're, you know, protesting all the time, then you're not. You know, you're trying to find a way to gather other people to your cause, then you're not giving consent. So he's not saying that we have to have some sort of formal social contract to give that consent, but we do have to be behaving as though we accept it, and not just out of fear, right? Not just out of, and we aren't, right? I mean, when you go and vote, you're not thinking, my God, you know, if I don't vote, you know, the Manhattan cops are going to come to my door and, you know, force me, basically, or to shoot me or something like that. A lot of us don't vote, but that doesn't mean anything necessarily either, because as long as we're living here peaceably and not protesting, you know.
Pay your taxes.
Right? There's another good side that you're accepting the system. So he's practical in that regard. But, you know, he is saying if there's enough people angry about this, even if it's a rather ancient takeover of land that is seen as illegitimate, like maybe the power of England over Ireland, you know, and that's a pretty good example of people continually protesting and rebelling and trying to get their autonomy back, right? So in that case, it's legitimate if they can do it. Okay, so do I need to say anything back here? No, we pretty much covered that. Okay. So his limits, or his rules, and again, this kind of applies to just war theory. You can tease out a Lockean just war theory here. Is that first of all, you need to make sure that your side is actually just, that your claim to your right is actually just. But not only that, you have to be sure that you can actually achieve what you're set out to do. And that means taking into account how many people are on your side, what is the, in other words, what is the likelihood of success? Okay. You have to understand that any such action is going to result in people dying, and is it worth it? Okay. So this all probably helps with that question, right, Brent?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It may not be good enough, I really, whenever I read this again, I feel like it's almost like Locke has two faces. One, the sort of radical revolutionary, and the other, the conservative that, agrees with Hobbes that disorder is undesirable for the most part. He in a way wants both, but he definitely wants the people to feel their power, to know that they're ultimately responsible for their government. He has a chapter on usurpation, but he applies the same sort of logic there as to conquest. Usurpation means when somebody basically takes over the kingship in a coup, what we would call a coup, or some perceived illegitimate takeover. Or maybe even like in the Glorious Revolution, where James threatened to Catholicize the country, and so this might be seen as a usurpation because he wasn't representing what they considered to be a legitimate monarch at that point. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about tyranny. Here we see him really going back and forth again. And it's a little bit difficult to tease out exactly what would justify regicide, which is the killing of a king, or what he would call tyrannicide, because here he distinguishes between a tyrant and a king, And a tyrant is a king or an executive who is using more power than he has been delegated and exercising power beyond his rights. Now, in this chapter, he is very well aware that there are many people who are uncomfortable with the idea of even discussing touching the king, certainly imprisoning the king, doing anything to the king, because the king is still considered by a lot of people as sacred. There's that hangover from the past of the divine right way of thinking. And it was still around during the French Revolution. There were people, even revolutionaries, who were having a hard time with what to do with the king, because he had this, this cachet that was difficult for people to stop thinking about. Locke is aware that there are many people then that think of the king's person, that is his bodily, existence, as sacred and untouchable. And you might be able to protest and complain and redress your grievances to the king, or you might even be able to revolt and change the system, but still not touch the king, right? Now, one thing that he says is, if more or less you consider the king's person to be sacred, that doesn't mean that you cannot oppose all of his officers. And after all, he says, the king is just one man, so without the power of all the people working for him, he doesn't have much power, so he's not very threatening anyway. Well, that turns out to not be true because of the reputation and the aura around a king. That's a great deal of power that they wield just psychologically. But this is the first thing that he says to kind of reassure. You don't have to kill the king. You could still have change. You could still have a revolution and not touch the king, because basically he's powerless without the rest of his government. He says this on 341 on the right-hand side of the page, down at the bottom. He says, as in some countries, the person of the prince by law is sacred. And so whatever he commands or does, his person is still free from all question or violence. Kind of reminds me of diplomatic immunity. Not liable to force or any judicial censure or condemnation. But yet opposition may be made to the illegal acts of any inferior officer or other commissioned by him. And actually, you know, like in the English Civil Wars, one of the first maneuvers people made was to say, you know, the king's officers have violated their rights and are not representing him well. They have gone beyond their rights, and the king is not being well served. That was the first sort of mental maneuver they made. The king, of course, you know, is the king, and we can't really criticize him, but he's being taken advantage of, okay? And that's a way of sort of allowing yourself to do what you want while still basically accepting the monarchy as a framework. I find these mental maneuvers very interesting. People will do that for quite a long time. And then at a certain point, they just stop, okay? And the king is no longer sacred, and you know, there's no need for it. All right, so that's one scenario. Another scenario that he looks at is if the king's person is not considered sacred. So if, for instance, we are already in a system such as Locke prescribes, where the king is a mere executive and working for the legislature. He says the king still does not need to worry about his person if he upholds the law, but if he does not, if he violates his his command under these circumstances, then he is in a state of war with the people, and as such he loses all of his right to, you know, basically to claim any superiority or any sort of inviolability. Okay, I think this is the way Locke really wanted people to see the king. Okay, the first argument is for those who are just so queasy about this that you've got to give them some other way of dealing with it. But this is the way he sees it, a king. He's an executive. If he goes beyond his right, he is in a state of war with the people because he's threatening their legislature and he's threatening their survival. Okay? And so what do you do with him? Well, one thing you can do is watch for it ahead of time. Vigilance. And this would happen in the legislature for the most part. They'd be watching to see if he's doing this. But he again reassures up at the top of 343, says, if a long train of abuses or actions show the counsels all tending that way, how can any man any more hinder himself from being persuaded in his own mind which way things are going, or from casting out how to save them, how to save himself, than he could from believing the captain of the ship he was carrying him and the rest of the company to Algiers, when he found him always steering that course, though crosswinds, leaks in his ship, and want of men and provisions did often force him to turn his course another way for some time, which he steadily returned to again as soon as the wind, weather, and other circumstances would let him. What is he doing there with this fanciful language about the captain of the ship?
That was a hard analogy to follow.
Yeah.
It was pretty tough.
Yeah. It reminds me of in Plato's Republic, where, you know, we have that metaphor of the ship of state, and nobody knowledgeable is at the helm. And so in his case, the philosopher knows where to steer the ship, but they won't let him.
Isn't that like pooing on democracy though? Like direct democracy?
Yeah, in that case it was. Yeah. Locke's not saying the same thing. He's using a similar image, but he's not saying the same thing. Right, because in the case of the Republic, it's to criticize how these democratic leaders just basically take advantage and divide people and steer the ship wherever the heck they want. In this case, it's the king who would be doing this. And what he's saying is, okay, the legislature sees that whenever the king can, he's trying to steer towards tyranny. And he might have to backpedal sometimes and, actually pay lip service to the parliament, maybe ask it for, to convene it and ask for its help to gather taxes, for instance. But whenever he can get away with it, he doesn't convene parliament, or he blocks the parliament from convening itself. Maybe he spends money or he takes actions without their consent, makes war in unjust wars that they don't approve of. All of these are signs that the executive is going too far, and he probably would often come back to pretending to be respectful or pretending to get approval. So he's saying you need to watch and use your common sense. And if it looks like he's steering most of the time towards tyranny whenever he gets a chance, if he's trying to take more power than is his just due, then you can assume that he would like to be a tyrant. So the time to take action is while the legislature can still convene, when the people still have the ability to act at the political level to rein him in, rather than waiting until we get to the point where you have, like in the English Civil War, the parliamentary army and the monarch's army. And then things are quite a bit more dangerous. So this theme of vigilance runs really deep in this chapter. And again, it's a check. It's a type of check on executive power, and it could be applied to legislative power as well, but Locke doesn't spend hardly any time on that because that's not what he's worried about. But this idea that you should watch and you should be suspicious and make some assumptions, use your common sense and make assumptions that, probably if he does these things, that means he wants more power. Not to wait until he takes the ultimate steps. Okay? You want to do this, you want to have this vigilance, and you want to check the king or the executive before he gets out of hand. Because at that point, you can still have a legislature and you can still have an operating government. And maybe you arrest him, or you simply, take away his money, right? There's a number of things that they could do. Give him a warning, and then if that doesn't work, do one of those things. In which case you've still got a government, you've still got order. But he makes a distinction between, the dissolution of society itself and the dissolution of the executive, the dissolution of government too. He says society is in danger of being dissolved, okay, if we let this go too far, so that the legislature can't act. Society meaning those reasonable people who could actually make something happen and preserve the social contract. When it gets to the point of chaos, then you don't have that. Okay? It becomes difficult to get it back. So there are signs that society is in danger of being dissolved or breaking down when the executive alters the legislature. Okay, or you could say when the legislature alters itself as well. When the executive hinders the legislature from meeting, okay, which was a frequent theme in English history. They just didn't, they prevented them. They actually barred the doors in some cases, bring the troops in and prevented them from entering the assembly. When procedures for election are altered without the people's consent, or when the king hands his country over to a foreign power, which could include wrong marriage, actually. I mean, you think of this as making an alliance or allowing a foreign power to come in and take over, but it might be as simple as marrying the wrong person, okay? In this case, maybe a Catholic, or, marrying a woman from a country that then uses that connection to begin to, rule your land.
You don't have any control of that, as like the legislature can say, I see you over there with Catherine Fairborn, I'm gonna
Uh-huh.
shut that down right now.
Right. Well, they could. They could, or they could prevent the marriage from happening to begin with. Or pass a law saying what kind of person the executive can marry. Or what kind of power that brings. I mean, literally, they have all the power. But they have to anticipate this ahead of time and not have such reverence for the king that they allow him to do whatever he wants. I think for quite a long time in English history, probably, I don't know, it could have even been into the 20th century, they had passed a law against marrying Catholics. And the king couldn't be a Catholic.
But so if Locke is, if the executive of the king doesn't have power already, I mean, if he marries a Catholic, if he marries a Protestant,
Right, but he can try to get, this is what he's getting at, is that if you have an executive, that executive may still try to gain more power than he has a right to.
By literally any means possible.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And that might mean allying with a foreign power and using their power to dominate your country, right? So the executive is, in his mind, the most dangerous thing. You have to have one, because you have to have prerogative, there's a lot of times when you need that immediate action to protect your country or to get your country out of a jam. But because of that executive prerogative, that's a lot of power. And such an executive, especially with all the history behind him, could get the idea that, well, he doesn't really like this legislative supremacy and, begin to take the power back. That's what he's afraid of. Yeah. There's so much history there. It would have made more sense, really, and, it really does make more sense, to make the executive not a monarch, but an elected executive, like we did, But he's just not quite there.
So I want to make sure I'm understanding this. Does he base the main prevention of tyranny to him is that he does not want society to dissolve, correct?
Right.
He wants it to remain intact so his government can stay intact.
Right. He wants to prevent that at all costs, because if society is dissolved,
because he said at that point, it says right here that you're in a hopeless state for the most part, right?
Right. I probably overstated. It's never completely hopeless.
Because I guess you could go back to the state of nature.
You're back to the state of nature, right? And it can take quite a while to get back to the social contract and civilization. Things are very, very precarious. So you want to try to avoid that if at all possible. Fairly hopeless situation. It's never completely hopeless. Hobbes would say it is. You do this and there's going to be utter chaos and people are going to continue to die, and it's going to be a very scary thing. For Locke, it's incredibly inconvenient and difficult to recover from, but it's not impossible. He attributes the social contract with civilization. So what you lose with the dissolution of society is civilization. People lose a lot of the property that they've built up, the businesses that they have that rely upon the law and enforced contracts to keep them in place. And pretty soon you're down to, I've got a plot of land and I'm going to defend it. That's about all you've got. That's not nearly as good. So we certainly don't want to go there unless we have to. And I think that Locke has this reputation for being the philosopher of revolution, but just notice how much he tries to avoid it, and how much he wants people to understand the impact and the damage that can be done by it, and what you need to do to prevent it from happening. The king needs to be smart and know his limits. The legislature needs to be smart and know its place. It needs to watch the king carefully. It needs to take proactive steps to make sure that he doesn't get out of hand. So there's a lot of warning. Okay.
So that kind of mitigates his two-facedness, kind of.
Yeah, it does. You mean the going back and forth?
Yeah.
Do you think what side do you think he comes down on then? Is it more the cautionary side, ultimately, for you?
I think, it kind of seems like he's still cautionary, but he still wants that stability. That stuff is paramount, priority. But and like Hobbes, he's like, but you have options.
Right.
And because no one's really talked about them before, I'm going to go into like explicit detail.
I don't know. I think I'm under the impression that he actually has a similar mindset to Hobbes. They both have clear objectives. They want people to follow their system. I feel like he uses revolution as a tool so people follow his system. He explains it so much that I guess that he like shows like the dark side and what can happen from it.
Yes, he does. He does. I mean, he wants to make it clear you're rolling the dice when you appeal to heaven.
So you think it's like a scare tactic, like you don't want this, so don't revolt. Okay.
And you don't want revolt, so make sure this government actually is responsive to the people.
Hobbes did the same thing. I mean, but he doesn't say you can't revolt. That's the main difference to me.
Yeah. Locke certainly says you can revolt, and that's the ultimate threat against tyranny, in his view. Hobbes says you can't revolt, although, it can happen, but you're not supposed to.
It's really interesting because it seems like they use revolution as a crutch to show how important their system is. They just use it in different ways. Like Hobbes says you can't do it and explains the total danger of it to keep people in his society or his government form, and then Locke just does it different. I can't really explain it, but he does it a different way.
Yeah.
He gives them the option.
He's still threatening.
Yeah, he still threatens, but he says that if you follow my rules, you can avoid it pretty much.
There is that one spot in Hobbes where he talks about natural punishments for when the sovereign violates the law of nature. And he does mention in that one spot rebellion. Rebellion is a natural punishment of the sovereign's violation of the laws of nature. So there is that threat there, and that teaching that, hey, you better try to be a rational, decent monarch, because even though people shouldn't revolt, they can. And, it's far better to follow the laws of nature and provide good government for people.
Like
that's there.
Yeah, like both of these thinkers had so many ulterior motives.
Yes.
They both did.
I guess I can see that, considering who was reading this, I, the average citizen, was reading this back in the day. It was the legislators and kings, and oh gosh, those people out there could do this.
Right.
We would be sitting here these are some good ideas. Which the founders did, but people didn't.
That's a good point. It depends on what people do with it and what they find in it. And when Locke talks about down to the third or fourth generation, you could still revolt. That sounds kind of passionate, you know what I mean? And you should never accept injustice, even if it's in the past. That sounds terribly revolutionary. And one wonders why he bothers to put that in there, because that's really quite extreme language, then followed up with, but you can prevent these things from happening by watching and by understanding.
Oh, I didn't even realize you said that right there.
The best fence against rebellion. Yeah,
I didn't even read that yet. That's funny.
Right. Yeah, that's what he says. He says his doctrine is the best fence, meaning.
That's convenient.
Yeah, meaning that if people really understand what government is for and what government should be doing to serve the people, then this rebellion won't be necessary. Right?
Well, I guess when he talks about the generations, because the monarchy was passed down through nepotism, he's saying to the king, your son or your daughter, or whatever, 2 generations down, could have to deal with your
Yeah.
tyrannical.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a warning. So whether it is the best fence against rebellion or whether there's something better is an open question, but certainly, he's saying if you really understand the foundations of government and what it's for, you will not press people into this desperate act. And he deals directly with regicide, or maybe what he would call tyrannicide, and he's not prone to quoting extensively, but he does quote extensively from the Scottish Quaker Barclay on page 350. You might wonder what he's doing there. Let's see, actually it starts on the bottom of 349 where he says, this is Barclay in Contra Monarchum, so anti-monarchy, anti-monarch. Self-defense is a part of the law of nature, nor can it be denied the community even against the king himself. But to revenge themselves upon him must by no means be allowed them, it being not agreeable to that law. Wherefore, if the king should show an hatred, not only to some particular persons, but sets himself against the body of the commonwealth, whereof he is the head, and shall, with intolerable ill usage, cruelly tyrannize over the whole, or considerable part of the people, in this case the people have a right to resist and defend themselves from injury. But it must be with this caution, that they only defend themselves, but do not attack their prince. They may repair the damage received, but must not for any provocation exceed the bounds of due reverence and respect. So Barclay was obviously trying to preserve the idea of the sacredness of the king, and basically to preserve the system, but say, sometimes you need to change the system, but you don't touch the king, and you don't touch the idea of the sacred monarchy. You can do it without that. So again, he's back to, this is similar reasoning to what he gave before, where, some say, well, you can attack the officers of the king, but not the king himself, okay? But here Locke disagrees with Barclay. And the way that he does it is just interesting. And this would be an example of where he sounds extremely revolutionary. He says, sort of mocking Barclay, how do you resist force without striking? Or how do you strike without reverence, with reverence? In other words, how do you stop this king and still have any reverence for him? If you're taking action, even if it's just against his officers, you basically have no respect for him, right? So this mental maneuver that Barclay wants to do, he's disagreeing with here. He says, he that shall oppose an assault only with a shield to receive the blows, or in any more respectful posture without a sword in his hand, to abate the confidence and force of the assailant, will quickly be at an end of his resistance. Doesn't make any sense, okay? You have to do what it takes. And that may mean striking the king, because the king does have this potential power. People can rally around him. So what Locke says is that if the king usurps his rightful place, he unkings himself. It is no longer a king. Okay? It is in his own way a mental maneuver. Okay? But and he quotes Barclay again here. Only this time, I think it's more or less in agreement with what Locke would say. He says, "What then can there no case happen where the people may of right and by their own authority help themselves, take arms, and set their king imperiously domineering over them? None at all, while he remains a king. Honor the king, and he that resists the power resists the ordinance of God, are divine oracles that will never permit it. The people therefore can never come by a power over him unless he does something that makes him cease to be a king." Okay? Now, that's still a mental maneuver on the part of Barclay, but that's something that Locke agrees with. The king, in effect, is no king once he does this, and so he is in that state of war with the people. Okay.
So unking himself, he unking himself by doing that.
Right. But all of this is because Locke included, people of this time just weren't quite wrapping their minds around the fact that the executive could not be a monarch. You know what I mean? They just weren't quite there yet. They were still thinking of the executive as a monarch, a hereditary monarch. And they had, hundreds and hundreds of years of this, this reputation of the monarchy to deal with, and the way that people felt about it, and they just couldn't quite see their way to just saying the king or the executive is somebody who works for the people.
Because what else would they call them?
They'd have to call him something like the executive, or,
Right.
well, now the president, right? But I mean, yeah, they just, weren't quite there yet. They could see diminishing his power, which is what happened in the Glorious Revolution. They took away a lot of his power, but not all of his power. He still had a lot of prerogative. And he was still treated with a great deal of respect. The new king that was put, William and Mary, the king and queen that were put in place, they were treated with a great deal of respect. But they were hemmed in and basically told, well, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. You can't tell people not to worship this way, and you can't, stop people from the parliament from convening and when it wants to. Okay. But that didn't mean that they didn't have a reverence and that people weren't still bowing to the king in the palace, It would just take a long time for people to get past this. And so I think this is why Locke struggles with it so much and why he seems to go back and forth here. It's not as clear-cut as you would like. Yeah. Obviously, the Americans erred on the side of the revolutionary content, right? And the long list of abuses of King George, I don't even know if they would have been good enough for Locke. I don't know.
Well, the taxation of the hers, that's not the nail in the coffin.
Right.
But I think he could have
It's a big one.
built a case they have.
And quartering troops in people's homes without their consent. Yeah. Maybe. But they probably should have tried a little bit harder to work things out first. And of course you have the special circumstance of being so far at a distance. That makes that situation pretty different. Kind of hard to know what he would say about it. All right, so I am at an end as far as what I wanted to comment on, but do you guys have any questions or need for further clarification?
So I'm gonna check the questions just to make sure because I picked the two ones when I started.
Okay.
one of them.
On Friday, we won't have class. We'll just let you work on this. But if you do want to come and see me, I'll be in my office.